Joining me now is Benjamin Netanyahu, former Prime Minister of Israel. I am pleased to have him here. He's on a visit to the United States, just returned from London also, where he was, I assume, explaining what?
Well, I think that a lot of people understand that Israel is now facing a war of terrorism, and that like any democracy faced with this terrorist threat, it must take action to defend its citizens.
Do you think Israel worries? I asked Dennis Ross about this, who's also on this program after you. Worries about international criticism when you have this kind of thing? Sharon outraged, this is a Herald Tribune, Sharon outraged criticized even in Israel, but Sharon pledges to employ everything at our disposal.
I think the majority of the Israeli public understands that Israel has to defend itself. Israel has shown remarkable restraint, including now.
Has there, in your judgment, been excessive retaliation?
No, I don't think so.
Because what's happening over the weekend, there was criticism of the extent of the retaliation by Israeli columnists and others,
yes,
and political science.
We can have, because Israel is the democracy, you can have some people who will give criticism.
I point that out just to say this is a question that's under debate in Israel.
Unlike Arafat's dictatorship, where he can do anything he wants and he calls the shots. And unfortunately, they're lethal shots. But you asked me principally about air power.
Yeah.
Look, this country...
Should they use F-16s? Was that an
Look at this country.
excessive retaliation?
Look at this country. It used F-16s, and rightly so, against Saddam's aggression against another country, Kuwait. It used F-16s against another dictatorship, Milosevic, and it bombed a lot of targets. And by the way, I think America did the right thing. They did absolutely the right thing. But America's cities weren't targeted. Nobody was bombing Washington or New York. You didn't have just bombardments of Times Square or Macy's. You didn't have shoppers being blown up.
It's a fair point, and no one can put yourself in the face of people who are experiencing the terror. And some will argue that that is one of the reasons that you won election when you defeated Peres to be prime minister, was because there was the fear of all those buses being attacked, and nobody in Israel felt safe.
You're absolutely right, and the people want that safety, and we got it safe. Actually, we had about 3 years where we got it safe. We stopped the terrorism. Now, how did we do that? Not by making profligate concessions to Arafat. We got it because Arafat understood that if he would wage a war of terror against us, he would suffer unbearable costs to his own regime, not to the people. He knew that. He knew that I had a unified government behind me that would back me up, and terror dropped precipitously by 90%, 95%.
But there were still acts of terrorism.
Very little. You could compress it into 1 week's events in the whole 3 years. In fact, to the point where by the 99 elections, 3 years later, terror or security wasn't even an issue in the elections. I think that we have a much tougher job now. The government now has to bring down Palestinian expectations. They have received...
Expectations of what?
Receiving everything, everything, by cowering Israel, by bombarding it with a terrorist war of attrition. This is what Arafat wants. He wants to basically have Israel bow in submission, give him not only the West Bank. He said the other day, 3 days ago actually, he said that the goal is to have millions of Palestinians flood Israel. He said we want the full realization, he said, of the right of return, the full dismantling of the state of Israel.
He said we want the full dismantling of the state of Israel?
The full realization of the so-called right of return, which means the destruction of the state of Israel.
Well, he's been arguing that in negotiations.
Well, if
that's a point. That's not a new idea. He's been talking about having full right of return. I mean, that's one of the principal points that they debate about.
Well, they
negotiate about.
One of the things that any Israeli will tell you is that if you have somebody opposite you who's saying, I want to dismantle the Jewish state, he's not a partner for peace.
Okay, but that's a different thing than wanting to dismantle the Jewish state.
Oh, no, it is. It is not the same. It is exactly the same thing, Charlie. And I think this is the point. We believed that Arafat accepted the idea of Israel's existence. We gave him territory in Oslo, money, 40,000 guns that are now being trained against us, international recognition, access to the White House. He got all that in return for one thing, the renunciation of violence, and the agreement that anything that we have to resolve, any dispute that we have to resolve between us will be done peacefully, non-violently. He's chucked all that. He's thrown that to the waste paper basket. He is now using systematically terrorism against us.
Let me ask you this. I'm happy you're here. if he had accepted what Barack put on the table, would you have been pleased?
No.
And that had been the deal?
No. I think dividing Jerusalem.
So you're happy he didn't take the deal?
Sure, but I'm not happy that having been offered everything that he says in the West, maybe on Charlie Rose's show too, he says every time he appears in the West or one of his spokespeople appear in the West, he says, just give me a West Bank state with half of Jerusalem as its capital, I'll give you peace. In Camp David, Barack offered him exactly that. Now, I think dividing Jerusalem is scandalous, and I think those suggestions were very damaging to Israel's security. But that's not the point.
So you would not have been happy if he took the deal?
Absolutely not. But that is irrelevant. That's an internal Israeli discussion.
Suppose he had taken the deal, what would have happened then? I mean, would the deal have been able to, what would have happened?
Well, we'd have elections, and whoever, if the people agreed to go that route, that's what would have happened. But
Barack believes he could have sold it to the Israelis.
I think that's irrelevant because we have a democracy. The main thing is he didn't take the deal. Everything that he says he wants, he was offered, and he rejected it. Because he said, because to his own people inside, day in and day out, in the media that he controls, in the radio and television that he controls, and every word in the Palestinian newspaper that he controls, he says, it's not the West Bank that I want. It's not a state next to Israel that I want. It's a state instead of Israel.
Wait. Do you believe that now the position of Arafat and the leadership of the Palestinian Authority is that they no longer want to live side by side in peace with Israel? They want to take over all of the territory, all of the land that is now Israel and the West Bank, and
that's exactly what they say.
But do you believe that's what? Is that what you believe?
Yes, and I think this is what is preventing peace.
And you believe that's their objective?
Yes.
If that's their objective, why ever even consider making peace with them?
Well,
if they want to destroy you.
This is why I insisted that in addition to the cessation of violence, what they have to do is abandon the fantasy of destroying Israel. Because these are really the two things. We can argue a territorial...
Some will say this is old rhetoric, as you know.
It is not old rhetoric. In dictatorships, what counts is not what they say in the corridors of the UN.
Fair enough.
Not what they whisper to the diplomats in Geneva.
Or say on interviews in Western press.
Absolutely irrelevant, because their people don't hear it. In dictatorships, the only thing that counts is what they say to their own people. The worst thing you can do about terrorism, in the face of terrorism, is to cower before.
But no one has said do that. I mean, that's a false issue. No one is saying you ought to cower in front of terrorism.
Well,
not the United States.
Let me tell you what I think we should do.
There's no one in Israel saying do that.
Let me tell you what I think we should do. I think Arafat will continue as long as he thinks he can get a benefit from this. The benefits, he's not going to get the Israeli people to surrender. That's just not going to happen. Right. In fact, the opposite is happening.
And nor would the United States and others allow that to happen.
I agree. I think the most important point, though, is does he get a political benefit? And if international opinion, American opinion, European opinion said, look, we see through you. We're not going to reward you with anything. We're not going to give you any political benefits because some actions in and of themselves are illegitimate. Bombarding and targeting children deliberately is illegitimate. Nothing justifies blowing up a bus. And you will stop it because we demand you to stop it. When Arafat hears that voice, coupled with Israeli firmness, yes, I think it could stop. There's no other way that it would stop if he thinks he'll get political gains.
But at what point is he going to stop? Because you might have thought that would have happened 10 days ago.
Well,
or a month ago.
Well, I won't.
We've had this escalating.
I won't get into the tactics. Sometimes sometimes you have to consider whether the application of greater force in a shorter time has the necessary.
So in other words, if you were prime minister, you may be different than Sharon because you would have used more force quicker.
No, I wouldn't second guess the prime minister, and I think he's leading the country right now in the right direction. And I think that part of the problem we have is that the country was led in the wrong direction.
What do you say to those who
before that
by Barack?
Look, when did the terrorism begin? You know, it began after Barack made these extraordinary concessions that you talked about, unimaginable to most Israelis. He made them at Camp David. And the violence, Arafat spurned these concessions, believing he could get now that Israel was basically on a slippery slope and would give him everything. And he began the violence, trying to press more and more and more. So admittedly, it's much more difficult now.
But the real turn came after the real turn came after the visit.
Well, you know, the Palestinians are really changing their tune. The first thing they said was that the reason for the violence was the Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount. Then they said the reason for the violence is occupation.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the violence occurred after Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount.
Actually, it began before.
But not in a significant way. I mean, there was a different level. Come on.
Yeah, but they could always use any pretext. That's not important. Arafat controls it. He turns it on and turns it off. So the pretext changes. Now they've got the new pretext, the settlements. Now the settlements is the pretext. They think they can do public
Well, speaking
opinion.
Of settlements, what do you think of the Mitchell Commission report?
I think the report on the whole is heads or suggests rather something very important, and that is the unconditional stoppage of terrorism. And obviously that would mean the immediate stoppage of Israeli response to terrorism. I think that's the right thing. Unconditional, unlinked, that is the correct thing.
And also a stop in the growth of settlement.
They say that this could be conducive.
Freeze.
They say that this could be conducive to confidence building. But
why wouldn't it?
Well, I think it's. I mean,
what Mitchell said is that there's a total lack of a total mistrust among the two. Total mistrust.
I respect George Mitchell a lot, but I also respect my own following and my own intimacy with the events. Hell, forgive me, Arafat was offered the uprooting of settlements. He was offered all of the West Bank. He was offered pieces of Israel even in pre-67.
In charge of getting new, in exchange for getting new land.
Before the violence began, and he began the violence having been offered all of that. So the settlements aren't the pretext, that aren't the reason, they're a pretext. Nor is the so-called occupation, because the Palestinians govern now 100% of the Palestinians. Nor is Sharon visits the pretext. The pretext is that Arafat cannot cut a territorial deal, because the battle between us right now is not territorial, it's existential. It's over Israel's basic right to exist. This is what he couldn't sign on. This is the reason we have conflict. This is the root of the conflict.
Benjamin Netanyahu, former Prime Minister of Israel. When we come back, we'll talk with others. Stay with us.